In Portland's rain-soaked downtown, a 67-year-old retired social worker was about to challenge everything society believed about family. What started as a solitary Thanksgiving morning took a shocking turn when she came face to face with 50 forgotten souls. Dorothy Martinez wasn't your typical abandoned grandmother. For 40 years, she had navigated human suffering, known for seeing dignity in desperation. When she encountered Portland's homeless community with untouched feast, she was walking into transformation. Dorothy's defiance against loneliness would lead to connections bridging every divide. What began as family rejection would become chosen, family bound by gratitude, not genetics. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Dorothy Martinez's hands moved with practiced precision as she basted the 20-pound turkey for the final time, its golden skin glistening under the kitchen lights. The aroma of sage and rosemary filled her modest Portland apartment, mingling with the scent of her grandmother's cornbread stuffing and the sweet potato casserole that had been her late husband Miguel's favorite. She glanced at the dining room table, set for 12 with her good china, the set she'd been saving for special occasions for the past 3 years since retirement. This was supposed to be the year everything came together again. The morning light filtered through rain-streaked windows, casting gentle patterns across the hardwood floors Miguel had installed himself 25 years ago. Dorothy hummed softly as she moved between the kitchen and dining room, making final adjustments to the centerpiece of autumn leaves and small pumpkins she'd arranged yesterday. At 67, she still moved with the purposeful energy that had carried her through 4 decades of social work, though her silver hair now framed a face marked by laugh lines and the quiet wisdom that comes from listening to thousands of life stories. Her phone buzzed on the counter. David's name appeared on the screen, and Dorothy's heart lifted. Her eldest was probably calling to confirm what time everyone would arrive. "Mom, hey." David's voice carried that particular tone she'd learned to recognize over the years, the one that preceded disappointment. "So, about today." Dorothy's hand tightened on the phone. Through the kitchen window, she could see her neighbor Mrs. Chen hanging laundry despite the drizzle, and for a moment she focused on that simple, steady rhythm rather than the growing knot in her stomach. "What about today, mijo?" "Well, the thing is, I talked to Maria and Carlos last night, and we thought it might be nice to do something different this year. You know, shake things up a bit." David's words came faster now, the way they did when he was trying to convince a client to invest in his latest tech startup. "I flew them out here to California, and we're doing this whole thing at our place. Sarah's been wanting to host, and with the new house and all." The wooden spoon in Dorothy's other hand clattered to the floor. "You flew them out? When?" "Yesterday. It was kind of last minute, but you know how it is with flights during the holidays. I figured you'd understand. You always taught us to be flexible, right?" Dorothy stared at the turkey, its perfect golden surface now blurring slightly. 40 years of social work had taught her to read between the lines, to hear what people weren't saying. David hadn't forgotten to invite her. He'd chosen not to. "Of course," she heard herself say. "That sounds lovely. You're the best, Mom. I knew you'd get it. Hey, I should go. Sarah needs help with the appetizers. Love you." The line went dead before Dorothy could respond. She stood motionless in her kitchen, surrounded by enough food to feed a small army, the silence broken only by the gentle bubbling of cranberry sauce on the stove. Her phone rang again. This time it was Maria. "Mama, I'm so sorry about today." Maria's voice was rushed, filled with the particular chaos that came with managing 3 teenagers. "Roberto's mother had a fall yesterday, and his whole family is in crisis mode. We have to do Thanksgiving at their place to help coordinate care for Abuela Carmen. You understand, don't you? Family has to come first." Family has to come first. The irony wasn't lost on Dorothy. "Of course, mija. Is she going to be okay?" The doctors think so, but you know how it is. She's 83 and— Maria's voice trailed off, perhaps realizing she was talking to a 67-year-old woman about the vulnerabilities of age. Anyway, we'll make it up to you soon. I promise. Maybe Christmas? After Maria hung up, Dorothy found herself staring at the dining room table. 12 place settings. She'd been so careful with the count. David and Sarah, their 2 teenagers. Maria, Roberto, and their 3 kids. Carlos, who was supposed to bring his new girlfriend, and Mrs. Patterson from next door, whose own family lived across the country. She walked to the window and looked out at Mrs. Patterson's apartment. The windows were dark. Right. Mrs. Patterson had mentioned last week that her daughter had surprised her with a plane ticket to Denver. Dorothy's phone buzzed with a text from her friend Helen. "So sorry, honey. Emergency at the church. The shelter's heating system died and we're setting up temporary warming stations. Rain check on dinner?" Another buzz. Patricia. "Dorothy, I feel terrible, but my grandson was in a car accident in Seattle. Not serious, thank God, but I need to drive up there today. Can we reschedule?" Dorothy set the phone down on the counter and looked around her apartment. The turkey timer chose that moment to ring, its cheerful ding echoing through rooms that suddenly felt cavernous. She pulled the bird from the oven, its perfect golden skin mocking her with its beauty. 20 pounds of turkey, 3 sides, 2 desserts. Enough dinner rolls to feed a crowd. She sank into one of the dining room chairs, her hands folded in, her lap. The silence pressed against her ears like water. This was the sound of irrelevance, she realized. This was what it meant to become optional in your own family's life. A memory surfaced unbidden. Thanksgiving 1987, when Miguel was still alive and the kids were young. David, 14 and gangly, trying to carve the turkey like a man. Maria, 11, organizing the younger cousins who'd crowded around their table. Carlos, 8, sneaking extra marshmallows from the sweet potato casserole when he thought no one was looking. Miguel catching her eye across the chaos and winking, his expression saying what they'd often joked about, that their small apartment somehow expanded to hold whoever needed a place to belong. "The table always has room," Miguel used to say. "It's not about the size of the space, it's about the size of the heart." Dorothy stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the hardwood. She walked to the kitchen and stared at the abundance spread across every counter. Green bean casserole, mashed potatoes, stuffing, cranberry sauce, pumpkin pie and apple crisp cooling on the windowsill. 40 years of social work had taught her many things, but perhaps the most important was this. When you find yourself with resources and others have needs, you don't sit around feeling sorry for yourself. You act. She opened her junk drawer and pulled out a roll of aluminum foil, then began covering dishes with the efficiency of someone who'd organized countless community meals. The turkey went into her largest roasting pan. The sides found homes in various containers and disposable pans she'd bought for the occasion. As she worked, something shifted inside her chest. The ache of abandonment was still there, but it was no longer the only thing she felt. There was something else growing alongside it, a familiar sense of purpose that had sustained her through decades of helping families navigate their darkest moments. Dorothy Martinez had spent her career connecting people with resources, bridging gaps between need and availability. She looked at her loaded counter, then at her car keys hanging by the door. Portland's homeless population had grown significantly in the years since her retirement. She knew where they gathered, where they sought shelter from November's rain. She grabbed her warmest coat and began loading containers into canvas bags. The turkey alone would feed 15 people. The sides would provide dozens more with something warm and filling. Miguel's voice echoed in her memory. The table always has room. Today, Dorothy realized, she wouldn't be sitting at anyone else's table, hoping to be chosen. Today, she would create her own table, and every seat would be filled by someone who truly wanted to be there. She hefted the last bag of food, her muscles protesting slightly, a reminder that she wasn't the young woman who used to coordinate emergency meal services. But her spirit felt younger than it had in months as she headed for the door, leaving behind the perfectly set table and stepping into the rain-soaked morning with a car full of food and a heart full of renewed purpose. Dorothy's Honda Civic sat heavy with the weight of covered dishes, the back seat and trunk packed with enough food to feed a small congregation. She gripped the steering wheel with hands that had signed countless case files, navigated bureaucratic mazes, and held the trembling fingers of families in crisis. But this felt different. This felt personal in a way that 40 years of professional distance had never allowed. The windshield wipers beat a steady rhythm against Portland's persistent November drizzle as she drove through the Pearl District, past the gleaming condos and artisanal coffee shops that had transformed the neighborhood she'd once known as gritty warehouses. The gentrification told its own story, one she'd watched unfold through the eyes of displaced families who'd crossed her desk over the years. As she turned onto Burnside, the landscape shifted. Here, under the shadow of the bridge, was where Portland's most vulnerable population had carved out space in a city that increasingly had no room for them. Dorothy had driven this route countless times during her career, usually in a county vehicle with official paperwork and scheduled appointments. Today, she was just a woman with too much food and a heart raw from abandonment. She parked near the encampment that had grown along the river's edge, a collection of tents, tarps, and makeshift shelters that housed what the newspapers euphemistically called the unsheltered community. Dorothy knew better. These weren't statistics or case numbers. These were people with names, stories, and reasons for being here that were as complex as her own family's reasons for not being at her table. The rain had softened to a mist, but the air still carried the chill that would make tonight dangerous for anyone sleeping outside. Dorothy opened her car door and immediately felt the weight of curious eyes. A man in a military surplus jacket emerged from behind a blue tarp, his posture alert and protective. "You lost, lady?" His voice carried authority despite his circumstances, and Dorothy recognized something familiar in his bearing. The way he positioned himself between her and the rest of the camp, assessing threat levels, protecting his community. "No," Dorothy said, keeping her hands visible as she reached for one of the food containers. "I'm here because I have Thanksgiving dinner for anyone who wants it." The man's eyes narrowed. "You with the city? Some church group doing their yearly guilt trip?" Dorothy met his gaze steadily. "I'm Dorothy Martinez. I'm a retired social worker, and I'm here because my family left me alone today, and I have enough food for 50 people who might be hungry." Something in her tone must have convinced him, because his defensive posture relaxed slightly. "Frank Morrison," he said. "Doc Morrison to most folks here. And what makes you think we need your charity?" The word charity hung between them like a challenge. Dorothy had heard it used as both gift and weapon throughout her career. She looked at Frank Morrison, really looked at him, mid-60s probably, clean-shaven despite his circumstances. The way he held himself suggested military training, and the respect she could see in the peripheral vision of other camp residents suggested natural leadership. "Because," Dorothy said carefully, "I spent today cooking for people who decided I wasn't worth their time. And I'm guessing some of you might understand what that feels like." Frank studied her for a long moment. Behind him, she could see faces, peering out from tents and doorways. A young woman with paint-stained fingers, an elderly man reading a paperback book, a couple trying to keep two small children entertained with a cardboard box. "What kind of food?" Frank asked finally. "Turkey, stuffing, mashed potatoes, green bean casserole, pumpkin pie." Dorothy's voice steadied as she listed the dishes. "Enough for a real meal, not just sandwiches and soup." A woman's voice called, out from one of the tents. "Doc, my kids haven't had a real Thanksgiving dinner in 2 years." Frank's jaw tightened. Dorothy recognized the weight of responsibility in his expression. the same look she'd seen on her own face in the mirror. During her career when she'd had to make decisions that affected other people's lives. "Where?" he asked. "I was hoping to find a community center, somewhere with tables and chairs. Somewhere people can sit down and eat like—" Dorothy paused, searching for the right words. "Like human beings?" Frank finished, and there was no sarcasm in his voice, only understanding. Dorothy nodded. "I know someone who might help. Carmen Rodriguez runs the Morrison Community Center about 6 blocks from here. If she'll open it up, we could do this right." Frank looked back at his community, then at Dorothy's car loaded with food. "You realize what you're getting into? 50 people, all with their own stories, their own problems. Some of them haven't been inside a building in months. Some of them don't trust anyone in authority, and to them, you represent authority." "I've worked with people in crisis for 40 years, Dorothy said. "I know that everyone has a story, and most of those stories involve someone giving up on them. I'm not here to fix anyone or save anyone. I'm here because I have food and no one to share it with." Frank nodded slowly. "All right, Dorothy Martinez. Let's see if your friend Carmen is willing to open her doors on Thanksgiving Day." As he moved through the camp, Dorothy heard him speaking in low tones to various individuals. She watched as the young woman with paint-stained fingers emerged from her tent, as the elderly man carefully marked his place in his book, as the couple with children began gathering their things. Within minutes, a small crowd had formed around Dorothy's car. She found herself looking into faces that ranged from hopeful to skeptical to simply tired. But they were coming. Despite every reason they had to distrust another promise from another outsider, they were willing to take the chance. Frank returned to her side. Word spreading. "You might get more than 50. Dorothy thought about her perfectly set table for 12, now sitting empty in her apartment. "Good," she said. "The more the better." Dorothy's phone call with Carmen Rodriguez had been brief, but effective. Within 20 minutes, they had a location. Now, as word spread through the encampment like ripples across water, Dorothy found herself moving from one makeshift shelter to another, introducing herself to people whose names she would remember, long after this day ended. Her first stop was a weathered sedan parked at the edge of the camp, its windows fogged from the inside. Frank knocked gently on the driver's side window. "Eleanor? There's someone I'd like you to meet." The window rolled down to reveal a woman in her 70s, her silver hair neatly combed despite her circumstances. She wore a cardigan that had seen better days but was carefully maintained, and her posture spoke of decades of standing in front of classrooms commanding respect. "Eleanor Patterson," she said, extending a hand that bore the calluses of recent manual labor, but moved with the grace of someone accustomed to formal introductions. "And you are?" "Dorothy Martinez. I'm inviting people to Thanksgiving dinner at the Morrison Community Center." Dorothy found herself matching Eleanor's formal tone instinctively. "I'd be honored if you'd join us." Eleanor's eyes flickered, with something between hope and skepticism. "I don't accept charity, Miss Martinez. I've been self-sufficient my entire life." "It's not charity," Dorothy said, understanding immediately. "It's dinner. I cooked for 12 people who didn't show up, and I refuse to let good food go to waste. I need people to help me eat it." Eleanor studied Dorothy carefully. "You're not with social services?" "Retired. 40 years ago, I might have been the person trying to convince you to accept help you didn't want. Today, I'm just someone who doesn't want to eat alone." Something in Eleanor's expression softened. "I taught high school English for 32 years. Shakespeare, Dickinson, Morrison. I never imagined I'd be living in my car at 73. Dorothy felt the familiar ache she'd carried throughout her career, the recognition that catastrophe respected no one's dignity or accomplishments. Medical bills. Eleanor's nod was barely perceptible. Harold's cancer. Insurance covered most of it, but not all. and not the time I took off to care for him. By the time he passed, there was nothing left. Your children? They have their own problems. I won't be a burden. Eleanor's voice carried the weight of pride that had sustained her through decades of teaching teenagers, but now isolated her from help. Dorothy looked at the back seat of Eleanor's car, where she could see stacks of books, carefully folded clothes, and a small electric kettle. Would you consider coming not as someone who needs help, but as someone whose presence would make the dinner better? Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. What kind of stuffing did you make? My grandmother's cornbread stuffing. She was from New Mexico, and she added green chiles and chorizo. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That sounds lovely. I'll bring tea if you don't mind. I have some Earl Grey. Their next stop was a tent where the sound of children's laughter provided a startling counterpoint to the grimness of the surroundings. Frank called out a greeting, and a young man emerged, followed by a woman holding twin toddlers who looked to be about 3 years old. Marcus and Destiny Johnson, Frank said, and these are the twins, Hope and Faith. Dorothy felt her heart clench at the sight of the children. Hope was showing her sister something invisible in her small hands, both of them giggling at a joke only they understood. They were clean, well-dressed in hand-me-downs that had been carefully maintained and clearly loved. Miss Martinez is inviting people to Thanksgiving dinner, Frank explained. Marcus and Destiny exchanged a look that contained an entire conversation. Dorothy recognized the calculation, the weighing of dignity against need, the assessment of safety, the protective instincts of parents who'd learned to be cautious about strangers bearing gifts. Where? Destiny asked, adjusting Faith on her hip. Morrison Community Center. It's a safe place with proper facilities. Dorothy knelt down to the twins' eye level. Hi, Hope. Hi, Faith. I made pumpkin pie today. Do you like pumpkin pie? Hope nodded solemnly while Faith hid her face in her mother's shoulder. We've been staying in our car since Marcus got hurt at work, Destiny said, her voice carefully neutral. The girls haven't had a proper meal at a table in 2 months. Marcus stepped forward, his limp barely noticeable but clearly painful. Construction accident. Workers' comp is still being fought out by lawyers while we try to keep our family together. Dorothy stood, feeling the weight of their story. No one should have to choose between rent and medical bills. I'm not offering solutions, just dinner. But there will be other families there, other kids for Hope and Faith to play with. Other kids? Hope asked, suddenly interested. Yes, sweetheart. Other children who might like to meet you. Destiny and Marcus exchanged another look, and Dorothy saw the moment when Hope won over caution. Their next encounter was with a teenager who emerged from a lean-to constructed of shopping carts and tarps, with an efficiency that spoke of experience. The girl's dark hair was streaked with blue, and her clothes were paint-stained but warm. This is Sage, Frank said. Our resident artist. Sage looked Dorothy up and down with the assessing gaze of someone who'd learned to read people quickly. Let me guess. You're here to save us all from our terrible life choices. Dorothy laughed, surprising herself. I'm here because my kids ditched me for Thanksgiving, and I have too much food. But I'm curious about your art. Sage's defensive posture shifted slightly. You know about art. My late husband was a painter, house painter by trade, but he did murals on the weekends. Said art was what made the difference between existing and living. What kind of murals? Community centers, schools, anywhere people would let him. He believed art belonged in public spaces, not just galleries. Sage's eyes lit up despite herself. I do street art, murals mostly, when I can get permission, when I can't. She shrugged. Can I see some of your work? Sage hesitated, then disappeared into her shelter, returning with a battered sketchbook. Dorothy opened it. Carefully, finding herself looking at drawings that captured the humanity of the streets with a skill that took her breath away. There were portraits of Frank bandaging someone's wound, Eleanor reading to children, Marcus teaching his daughters to count. "These are extraordinary," Dorothy said, meaning it. "You've captured something about this community that most people never see." "What's that?" "That it's a community, that people take care of each other." Sage closed the sketchbook. "So what's the catch with this dinner? What do you want from us?" Dorothy met her gaze directly. "I want you to eat my food so it doesn't go to waste. I want to sit at a table with people who actually want to be there, and I want to hear your stories if you want to share them." "That's it?" "That's it." Sage considered this. "Fine, but I'm bringing my sketchbook. Might be interesting to draw whatever happens." As they moved through the camp, Dorothy met Tommy Sullivan, whose manic energy and guitar case suggested the kind of charismatic performer who could either elevate or derail any gathering, depending on his mood. She encountered Rosa Martinez, who spoke little English but whose eyes held depths of story that transcended language barriers. Each person represented a choice, to come or stay, to trust or remain guarded. Dorothy found herself not just inviting people to dinner, but being invited into glimpses of lives that had been shaped by circumstances she was only beginning to understand. By the time they'd made the rounds, nearly 30 people had committed to coming. Others remained skeptical or simply weren't ready to venture into an unfamiliar space. Dorothy respected their choice, leaving her phone number with Frank in case anyone changed their mind. As she prepared to drive to the community center to meet Carmen, Dorothy looked back at the collection of people gathering their things, preparing to trust a stranger with their Thanksgiving evening. Frank appeared at her elbow. "You sure about this?" he asked. "Some of these folks haven't been inside a building in months. Some have mental health issues, addiction problems, trauma that makes them unpredictable." Dorothy thought about her empty apartment, her perfectly set table, her children who'd found it so easy to exclude her from their plans. "Frank, I've worked with people in crisis my entire career. The only difference between them and my family is that they're honest about their problems." Frank nodded slowly. "All right then, let's go make this work." The Morrison Community Center sat on a corner lot like a beacon of possibility, its brick facade weathered but welcoming. Dorothy pulled into the parking lot just as Carmen Rodriguez emerged from the building, keys jangling in her hand and a look of determined efficiency on her face. Carmen was younger than Dorothy had expected, probably in her early 50s, with the kind of compact energy that came from years of managing crises and coordinating resources. She wore jeans and a Portland State University sweatshirt, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. "Dorothy Martinez?" Carmen extended her hand with a grip that was both firm and warm. "I have to admit, when you called about opening the Center for 50 Homeless People on Thanksgiving Day, I thought you might be having some kind of breakdown." Dorothy laughed despite herself. "I might be. My family abandoned me this morning, and apparently my response is to feed strangers." "Well, stranger things have happened in community work." Carmen's expression grew more serious. "I lost my mother to homelessness 8 years ago. She was too proud to ask for help, too ashamed to come to family. By the time we found her, it was too late." The shared understanding passed between them without need for further explanation. Dorothy recognized a kindred spirit, someone who'd channeled personal loss into professional purpose. "So," Carmen said, pushing open the center's front door, "let's see what we can do with this space." The main room was larger than Dorothy had hoped, with high ceilings and tall windows that let in the gray November light. Folding tables were stacked against one wall, chairs hung on a rolling rack. The institutional beige walls were brightened by children's artwork and community announcements in both English and Spanish. "How many tables do we need?" Carmen was already calculating, her experience in event coordination evident. "Let's plan for 60 people, Dorothy said. Frank mentioned word was spreading. They worked with the efficiency of two women who'd spent decades making the impossible happen on short notice. Carmen pulled tables from the storage room while Dorothy arranged them in a rough horseshoe shape that would encourage conversation. They gathered mismatched chairs from various rooms, plastic stackable chairs from the children's area, padded folding chairs from the senior center, even a few office chairs on wheels that made Dorothy smile. "Tablecloths?" Carmen asked, surveying their work. "I brought some plastic ones, but honestly, I think the tables are fine as they are. This isn't about impressing anyone." Carmen nodded approvingly. "Good. Nothing worse than making people feel like they have to worry about spilling something." As they set up a serving area using the center's industrial kitchen, Dorothy heard the front door open. She looked up to see Rosa Martinez entering quietly, carrying a canvas bag and moving with the careful awareness of someone accustomed to making herself invisible. Rosa approached the kitchen counter and began unpacking items from her bag: spices in small containers, a worn wooden spoon, aluminum foil wrapped around something that smelled wonderfully of garlic and cumin. "Rosa." Dorothy approached carefully. Rosa had spoken little English at the camp, communicating mostly through nods and gestures. Rosa looked up and smiled, then gestured toward Dorothy's food containers. "Ayuda? Help?" Dorothy nodded eagerly. "Sí, por favor." What followed was a wordless collaboration that reminded Dorothy why she'd fallen in love with community work in the first place. Rosa examined Dorothy's turkey with the eye of someone who understood food not just as sustenance, but as love made tangible. She unwrapped her own contribution, what appeared to be homemade tortillas, and began demonstrating how they could be used to create small, handheld portions of turkey and stuffing. Carmen watched from across the room as she set up a coffee station. "She's brilliant," she said quietly to Dorothy. "Rosa cleans offices at night, but she used to run a restaurant in El Salvador. She's probably forgotten more about feeding people than most of us will ever know." As they worked, people began arriving. Eleanor Patterson entered first, carrying a thermos of tea and moving with the dignity of someone attending a formal dinner party. She surveyed the room approvingly and immediately began straightening chairs and adjusting table settings with the precision of someone who'd spent decades organizing classroom spaces. Frank arrived with a group of about 10 people, including the Johnson family. The twins, Hope and Faith, immediately gravitated toward the children's area where Carmen had set up some toys and coloring books. Their laughter filled the space with a sound that transformed the institutional room into something warmer. "This is good," Frank said to Dorothy, his military bearing relaxed but still alert. "Big enough so people don't feel crowded, small enough so they don't feel lost." Sage arrived with her sketchbook and immediately claimed a spot where she could observe the room. She'd cleaned up since the morning, Dorothy noticed, and had traded her paint-stained jacket for a cleaner sweater that emphasized how young she really was. Tommy Sullivan entered with his guitar case, his energy filling the room like a live wire. "This is perfect," he announced to no one in particular. "Just like the old days at the Bluebird Cafe in Nashville. You know, before everything went to hell." More people continued to arrive. Some Dorothy had met at the camp, others who'd heard about the dinner through the informal network that connected Portland's homeless community. She watched as Carmen greeted each person by name, demonstrating the kind of relationship building that Dorothy recognized from her own career. As the room filled, Dorothy felt a moment of panic. What had she started? These weren't clients or case studies. They were real people with real needs, real stories, real expectations. She looked around at the mismatched furniture, the institutional lighting, the collection of strangers who'd agreed to trust her with their Thanksgiving evening. Then she saw Eleanor showing Rosa how to arrange the tea service, while Rosa demonstrated how to fold napkins in a way that would make each place setting special. She watched Marcus help Frank set up additional seating while Destiny settled the twins at a table where they could color while the adults prepared the meal. Carmen appeared at Dorothy's elbow. Second thoughts? Dorothy watched as Sage showed her artwork to Tommy, who responded with genuine enthusiasm and began improvising a song about the drawings. No, she said, just realizing that I have no idea what I'm doing. Neither do any of us, Carmen said. That's what makes it interesting. The front door opened again, and Pastor Williams entered, looking somewhat uncertain as he took in the scene. Dorothy recognized the expression, the well-meaning awkwardness of someone who wanted to help, but wasn't sure how to do it without condescending. "Showtime," Carmen murmured. Dorothy took a deep breath and moved toward the center of the room. It was time to begin. Dorothy stood at the center of the room, her hands trembling slightly as she looked around at the faces turned toward her. Nearly 50 people had gathered around the mismatched tables, their conversations dying down as they sensed the moment of transition from preparation to celebration. The institutional fluorescent lights seemed harsh suddenly, emphasizing the worn edges of clothing, the careful grooming that spoke of dignity maintained despite circumstances, the watchful eyes of people who'd learned to be cautious about promises. "I'm not good at speeches," Dorothy began, her voice carrying more clearly than she'd expected. 40 years of social work taught me to listen more than I talk. But I wanted to say something before we eat. She paused, looking at Eleanor Patterson, who sat with perfect posture at the nearest table, her thermos of Earl Grey positioned just so. At the Johnson family, where Marcus had one arm around Destiny, while the twins colored with crayons Carmen had provided. At Frank, whose military bearing had relaxed, but whose eyes still swept the room protectively. At Sage, who'd positioned herself where she could sketch while participating, her defensive shell cracked just enough to reveal curiosity. "This morning, I woke up expecting to cook for my family. They had other plans." Dorothy's voice caught slightly, but she pushed through. "I could have spent today feeling sorry for myself. Instead, I decided that if my blood family didn't want to share a meal with me, I'd find people who did." Tommy Sullivan, who'd been tuning his guitar in the corner, looked up with interest. Pastor Williams, who'd been hovering uncertainly near. The entrance moved closer. "But as I've met each of you today, I've realized something. I didn't come here to do you a favor. You're doing me the favor. You're giving me the chance to remember what Thanksgiving is actually supposed to be about. Not obligation, but gratitude. Not just sharing food, but sharing ourselves." Rosa Martinez, who'd been quietly arranging the last of the serving dishes, paused in her work and nodded, understanding crossing the language barrier. "So, before we eat, I want to say thank you. Thank you for trusting a stranger. Thank you for being here. Thank you for letting me be part of your community, even if it's just for tonight." There was a moment of silence, and Dorothy wondered if she'd said too much, revealed too much vulnerability. Then Eleanor Patterson began to clap, her measured applause joined by others until the room filled with the sound of appreciation. Frank stood up from his table. "Before we start eating, let's make sure everyone knows where things are. Bathrooms are down that hall. Carmen's got coffee going, and Eleanor brought tea. If you need anything, ask. We're all family here tonight." The word family hung in the air, carrying weight and promise. Dorothy felt something shift in her chest, the ache of abandonment beginning to transform into something else entirely. As people began moving toward the serving area, Dorothy noticed the careful choreography of community. Frank naturally positioned himself where he could monitor the room while helping serve. Eleanor took charge of beverages with the authority of someone accustomed to managing groups. Rosa worked alongside Dorothy, their wordless communication more effective than most conversations Dorothy had with people who spoke her language. The Johnson twins, Hope and Faith, became unofficial ambassadors of joy. Their excitement at seeing so much food, their delight in the company of adults who had time to notice them, created ripples of warmth throughout the room. Dorothy watched as hardened faces softened when the children approached, as people who'd been forgotten by society remembered what it felt like to be important to someone. "Miss Dorothy." Hope appeared at her elbow, tugging on her sleeve. "Can I help serve the pie?" "Of course, sweetheart, but let's eat dinner first, okay?" Faith, emboldened by her sister's success, approached with a shy smile. "I like your turkey. It's pretty." Dorothy knelt down to the girl's level. "Thank you, Faith. I cooked it just for you." The simple interaction drew smiles from others nearby. Dorothy realized that the children weren't just guests at this dinner. They were catalysts, reminding everyone present of innocence and possibility. Pastor Williams finally approached the group, his earlier uncertainty replaced by something that looked like genuine engagement. "Dorothy, I'm Pastor Williams from Grace Lutheran. I hope you don't mind me dropping by. I heard about your gathering and wanted to see if I could help." Dorothy studied his face, recognizing the well-meaning earnestness she'd encountered in many religious volunteers over the years. "Of course, Pastor. Have you eaten?" "Oh, I'm fine. I actually came to see if anyone needed spiritual counsel or—" "Pastor," Frank's voice carried a note of gentle warning. "Tonight we're just people eating dinner together. Nothing more complicated than that." Pastor Williams looked around the room, taking in the scene with fresh eyes. Children playing, adults laughing, people who clearly hadn't had a proper meal in too long, savoring every bite. The organic community that had formed around shared food and genuine presence. "You're right," he said finally. "May I just join you for dinner?" "Grab a plate," Dorothy said. As the evening settled into its rhythm, Dorothy found herself moving between tables, not as a host managing an event, but as a participant in something that felt increasingly magical. Conversations bloomed and died and bloomed again. Sage sketched quietly, capturing moments of connection. Tommy began playing soft background music that enhanced rather than dominated the atmosphere. At one table, Eleanor was deep in conversation with a man named Robert who'd revealed himself to be a former librarian. They were discussing books with the passion of people who'd found kindred spirits. At another, Marcus was explaining construction techniques to a teenager who'd expressed interest in learning a trade. Rosa had somehow transformed Dorothy's simple meal into something approaching a feast, her additions creating flavors that spoke of home and memory. People kept returning to the serving area, not just for seconds, but for the experience of choice, of abundance, of not having to worry about whether there would be enough. Dorothy found herself at Frank's table, sitting next to him as he watched the room with satisfaction. "This is good," he said quietly. "This is what community looks like." "I had no idea what I was doing," Dorothy admitted. "Best kind of community. Work. When you start with a plan, you miss the magic that happens when people just show up for each other." As if summoned by their conversation, Dorothy's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and saw David's name. Her son, calling from his perfect California Thanksgiving, probably feeling guilty, or maybe just checking to make sure she was okay. She looked around the room at her chosen family, at the laughter and conversation and genuine connection happening at every table. For the first time all day, the thought of talking to David didn't fill her with hurt. "Excuse me," she said to Frank, stepping outside to take the call. The rain had stopped, and Portland's evening air felt clean and full of possibility. Dorothy answered the phone with a calmness that surprised her. "Hi, David." "Mom, how are you doing? I've been thinking about you all day. I hope you're not sitting there feeling sorry for yourself." Dorothy looked through the community center's windows at the gathering inside. "Actually, I'm having the best Thanksgiving I've had in years." Dorothy returned from her phone call to find the atmosphere in the community center had shifted into something deeper, more intimate. The initial politeness of strangers sharing a meal had given way to the kind of authentic connection that emerges when people realize they're truly safe to be themselves. Tommy Sullivan had moved from background music to something more intentional, his guitar work weaving through conversations like a soundtrack to the evening's unfolding stories. He sat at the center table now, his instrument resting across his lap, his eyes bright with the kind of manic energy that could either illuminate or overwhelm. "You want to hear about family?" Tommy said, his voice carrying to the nearby tables. "I'll tell you about family. I had everything once. Record deal, tour bus, crowds singing my songs back to me. But when the bipolar kicked in hard, when the depression made it impossible to get out of bed for weeks at a time, you know who stuck around?" He gestured around the room with his guitar pick. "Nobody. Manager dropped me. Band found a new frontman. Label canceled my contract. But you know what the beautiful thing is? Sometimes losing everything is the only way to find out what actually matters." His fingers found a chord progression that Dorothy recognized as melancholy but hopeful. "I wrote this song in a shelter in Nashville 3 years ago. Never recorded it, never performed it for anyone who could make me money from it. But it's probably the most honest thing I've ever written." He began to sing, his voice rougher than it probably once was, but carrying a weight of experience that studio production could never capture. The song was about falling and rising, about the difference between success and significance, about finding family in the most unexpected places. Eleanor Patterson listened with the focused attention of someone who'd spent decades teaching students to appreciate literature and music. When Tommy finished, she set down her teacup with the kind of deliberate movement that commanded attention. "That was beautiful, Tommy. Thank you." Her voice carried the authority of the classroom, but also something more personal. "I spent 32 years teaching high school English, and I always told my students that the best literature comes from authors who've experienced loss. You've lived that lesson." She paused, looking around the table with the same directness. She'd probably used to engage reluctant teenagers. "I never thought I'd be homeless at 73. Harold and I had plans, travel, grandchildren, the comfortable retirement we'd saved for. But cancer doesn't care about your plans." Dorothy watched Eleanor's hands as she spoke, noting the careful way she held her shoulders straight, the dignity she maintained even while revealing her most vulnerable circumstances. The medical bills came first, then the time off work to care for him, then the funeral expenses that insurance doesn't cover. By the time Harold passed, our savings were gone, the house was mortgaged beyond its value, and I was too old to rebuild financially. She lifted her teacup, sipping slowly before continuing. "My children have their own struggles. Michael's going through a divorce, dealing with his own custody issues. Sarah's husband lost his job last year. I won't be another burden on their shoulders." Sage Williams looked up from her sketchbook, her blue-streaked hair falling across her face. "So you chose to be homeless rather than ask for help?" "I chose to maintain my independence rather than become a source of stress for people I love." Sage's laugh was sharp, but not unkind. "That's the most middle-class thing I've ever heard. You know what? I chose to be homeless too, but for the opposite reason. I left foster care because the people who were supposed to love me were the ones causing the stress." The room grew quieter as Sage set down her pencil, giving the conversation her full attention for the first time that evening. "I aged out of the system 6 months ago. 18 years old. Congratulations. You're an adult now. Good luck with that. But the thing is, I'd been taking care of my foster siblings for years anyway. Emma's 12, and Marcus, not this Marcus, different Marcus, he's 14 and has autism. The foster parents were collecting checks for 5 kids, but only actually caring for their own biological daughter." Dorothy recognized the anger in Sage's voice, the particular fury that came from adults failing children who had no other options. "So I had a choice. Stay and watch Emma and Marcus get hurt because I couldn't protect them anymore as an adult, in the house, or leave and hope they'd get placed somewhere better. I chose to leave, but I send them money when I can from selling my art. They don't know I'm homeless. They think I'm in college. Frank Morrison had been listening with the focused attention of someone who understood the weight of impossible choices. How old were you when you went into foster care? 7. My mom had addiction issues. My dad was never in the picture. The first placement was okay, but then that family moved out of state and couldn't take me. After that, it was a series of homes where I learned that staying invisible was safer than hoping someone would actually care. She picked up her pencil again, adding details to whatever she'd been drawing. Art saved me. Sounds dramatic, but it's true. When everything else was chaos, I could draw. I could create something beautiful out of nothing. I could make sense of things on paper that made no sense in real life. Marcus Johnson looked up from where he'd been helping his daughters at color. We all made choices, he said quietly. Destiny and I decided to stay in Portland when I got hurt because we thought the job market would be better here than back home in Arkansas. Thought we could make it work until my back healed and workers' comp came through. Destiny shifted, Faith on her lap, smoothing the child's hair with unconscious tenderness. We've been living in our car for 2 months, but we keep telling the girls it's an adventure. They think we're camping every night. Where do you shower? Do laundry? Eleanor asked with the practical concern of someone who'd recently faced the same logistics. There's a gym that lets you pay by the day, Marcus replied. Laundromat on Sandy Boulevard stays open late. The girls think it's fun to watch the clothes spin around. Hope looked up from her coloring book. I like the bubbles in the washing machines. The innocent comment drew gentle laughter from the adults. But Dorothy caught the look that passed between Marcus and Destiny, the weight of maintaining hope and normalcy for their children while navigating circumstances that would challenge any adult. Frank cleared his throat, drawing attention back to himself. Vietnam, 1969 to 1971. Came back with skills the civilian world didn't need and problems it didn't understand. Took me 20 years to admit I had PTSD. By then, I'd already lost 2 marriages, 3 jobs, and most of my family's patience. He looked directly at Pastor Williams, who'd been listening with increasing discomfort. Alcohol was the only thing that made the nightmares stop. Of course, it created different problems, but at least those were problems I could understand. Been clean for 8 years now, but by then the bridges were burned. What changed? Dorothy asked gently. Frank gestured around the room. This community. Found out that taking care of other people was something I was actually good at. Military. Medic training doesn't expire just because you're sleeping under a bridge. Started patching people up, helping newcomers learn the rules of survival. Gave me purpose again. Rosa Martinez had been listening intently, following the conversation through context and the few English words she recognized. She stood up suddenly and moved to her bag, returning with a small photo wrapped in plastic. She handed it to Dorothy, speaking softly in Spanish. Dorothy looked at the photograph. A restaurant interior, warm and inviting, with Rosa standing behind the counter wearing chef's whites and smiling. A man and 2 children stood beside her, clearly family. Tu restaurante? Dorothy asked in her rusty Spanish. Rosa nodded, then spoke in halting English. El Salvador. My restaurant. My family. She touched the photo gently. Gone now. Violence. We leave everything. The simple words carried the weight of loss that transcended language barriers. Dorothy understood without translation that Rosa had left behind not just a business, but an entire life, an identity, a community. The room fell quiet as the magnitude of each person's story settled over the gathering. Dorothy looked around at faces that had become familiar over the course of the evening, realizing that she'd learned more about courage, resilience, and the true meaning of family in this single dinner than she had in months of her comfortable retirement. Tommy picked up his guitar again, playing something soft and wordless that seemed to acknowledge the sacred nature of what had been shared. Outside, Portland's evening deepened toward night, but inside the community center, something profound was taking root. The kind of connection that happens when people risk being seen for who they truly are. Dorothy's phone buzzed again just as Tommy finished a gentle instrumental piece that had left the room in comfortable, contemplative silence. She glanced at the screen, David calling back. The timing felt like an intrusion, a reminder of the world outside this circle of genuine connection. She looked around the room at faces that had become dear to her over the course of the evening. Frank was helping Hope Johnson reach a piece of pumpkin pie while her parents cleaned up the twins' coloring supplies. Eleanor and Rosa were engaged in a wordless conversation about tea preparation that transcended their language barrier. Sage had moved to a new vantage point and was sketching the room's quiet intimacy. "I should take this," Dorothy said to no one in particular, but Frank caught her eye and nodded understanding. She stepped toward the community center's entrance, but not quite outside, close enough for privacy, but still within the warmth of the gathering. The phone's insistent buzzing seemed harsh against the room's gentle atmosphere. "Hello, David." "Mom, we got disconnected earlier. You said you were having a good Thanksgiving? I was worried you might be putting on a brave face." His voice carried that particular tone of concern that managed to sound both caring and condescending simultaneously. Dorothy watched through the doorway as Pastor Williams helped Tommy move his guitar to a safer spot while they rearranged chairs for easier conversation. The simple act of cooperation, of people naturally helping each other without being asked, felt like a rebuke to her son's assumptions. "I'm not putting on a brave face, David. I'm having dinner with friends." "Friends?" The surprise in his voice was unmistakable. "Mom, I thought you said you were alone this morning." "I was alone this morning. Now I'm with about 50 people who actually wanted to spend Thanksgiving together." There was a pause. Dorothy could hear background noise from David's gathering, his in-laws' voices, the sound of football on television, the casual chaos of a large family meal that had excluded her. "Wait, 50 people? Mom, what are you talking about? Did you go to some senior center thing?" Dorothy felt irritation rise in her throat. "No, David. I cooked all that food this morning, and instead of letting it go to waste, I brought it to people who were hungry. I'm at a community center having dinner with Portland's homeless community." The silence stretched long enough that Dorothy wondered if the call had actually dropped this time. When David spoke again, his voice carried a different quality, not concern but alarm. "Mom, you're at a homeless shelter? By yourself? That's not safe. You need to leave right now and go home." "I'm perfectly safe, David. I'm with friends." "Friends? Mom, these aren't your friends. These are strangers, and probably dangerous ones. You don't know what these people are capable of." Dorothy looked back into the room where Frank was now reading a picture book to the Johnson twins while their parents finished eating. Where Eleanor was showing Sage something in a small notebook, probably poetry, judging by Sage's interested expression. Where Rosa was carefully packaging leftover food into containers, her movements speaking of someone who understood the value of not wasting anything. "You're right," Dorothy said quietly. "I don't know what they're capable of, but I'm finding out. Tommy's capable of writing songs that make people cry. Eleanor's capable of maintaining her dignity despite losing everything. Frank's capable of taking care of an entire community. Rosa's capable of turning my simple cooking into something extraordinary." "Mom, listen to yourself. You're romanticizing homelessness. These people probably have drug problems, mental health issues. And my family has abandonment issues and emotional unavailability, but I still love them." The words hung in the air between them, sharper than Dorothy had intended, but true, in a way that felt liberating. "That's not fair," David said, his voice tight with the kind of hurt that came from being confronted with uncomfortable truths. "Isn't it? You invited Maria and Carlos to California without asking if I had plans. You assumed I'd just accept being excluded from my own family's Thanksgiving. You called tonight not because you missed me, but because you felt guilty." Dorothy realized that several people in the room could hear her side of the conversation. Frank had looked up from the picture book, his expression watchful but not intrusive. Carmen had paused in her cleanup efforts. But no one was staring or pretending not to listen. They were simply present, offering the kind of support that came from shared understanding of difficult conversations. "I didn't mean to hurt you," David said, and for the first time in the conversation, he sounded genuinely apologetic rather than defensive. "I thought you'd understand. I thought family was flexible." Family should be flexible, David, but it should also be present. It should show up. It should include people, not abandon them. She looked around the room again, seeing it with fresh eyes. "Do you know what I've learned tonight? I've learned that the people who society throws away are often the ones who understand loyalty and gratitude better than anyone else. I've learned that family isn't about blood relations or obligation. It's about people who choose to be there for each other." "So you're choosing homeless people over your actual family?" The question was meant to sting, to make her feel guilty or ashamed. Instead, Dorothy felt a clarity she hadn't experienced in months. "I'm choosing people who choose me back. I'm choosing people who appreciate my presence instead of taking it for granted. I'm choosing people who see me as valuable, not just convenient." David's voice softened. "Mom, you're valuable to us. You know that." "Do I?" "Because it didn't feel that way this morning when I realized that my entire family had made plans that didn't include me. It didn't feel that way when I sat alone with dinner for 12 people and realized that none of them thought my feelings mattered enough to consider." She paused, watching as Sage showed her latest sketch to Tommy, who responded with genuine enthusiasm and began picking out a melody that seemed to match the drawing's mood. "But you know what? I'm grateful that happened. Because if you hadn't abandoned me today, I never would have met these incredible people. I never would have discovered that there are folks in this world who understand what it means to show up for each other." "Mom." "I'm not finished, David. You called me twice tonight, and both times you've been more concerned about whether I'm safe than whether I'm happy. You've been more worried about the kind of people I'm with than grateful. That I'm not alone. That tells me everything I need to know about your priorities." Through the doorway, she could see that the Johnson twins had fallen asleep in their parents' laps, worn out by the excitement of the evening and the security of full bellies. Marcus and Destiny were speaking quietly with Frank about resources for families, while Carmen jotted down information on a piece of paper. "These people," Dorothy continued, "have spent the evening sharing their stories, their food, their presence with a stranger who showed up with too much turkey and not enough family. They've welcomed me into their community without asking what I could do for them or judging me for my circumstances. They've treated me like I matter." David was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried a different quality, less defensive, more reflective. "I didn't realize how much we'd hurt you." "I know you didn't. And that's part of the problem, isn't it? My feelings weren't important enough to consider." Dorothy realized that the room had grown quieter, that people were listening not out of nosiness, but out of recognition. These were people who'd had their own difficult phone calls, their own moments of having to choose between accepting disrespect and demanding better. "What do you want me to say, Mom?" "I don't want you to say anything, David. I want you to think about whether the way you treat people, especially family, reflects the values you claim to have. And I want you to consider that maybe, just maybe, the people you look down on might have something to teach you about loyalty and gratitude." She looked around the room one more time, taking in the scene of genuine community that had emerged from her morning's abandonment. "I need to go now. My friends are waiting for me." Dorothy ended the call and turned back toward the room, where Frank was watching her with something that might have been pride, and where Eleanor was holding out a fresh cup of tea, and where her chosen family was ready to continue their evening of authentic connection. Dorothy accepted the cup of tea from Eleanor with hands that were steadier than they'd been in hours. The confrontation with David had left her feeling both drained and strangely energized. the exhaustion that comes from speaking difficult truths, balanced by the relief of finally saying what needed to be said. "You okay?" Frank asked quietly as she settled back into the circle of conversation. "Better than okay," Dorothy replied, surprised to find she meant it. "Sometimes you don't realize how much weight you're carrying until you finally put it down." As if sensing the shift in energy, Rosa Martinez stood and began moving through the room with quiet purpose. Dorothy watched as she approached each table, not saying much. Her English was still limited, but somehow communicating through gesture and expression that she wanted to do something special with the remaining food. "What's she doing?" Sage asked, looking up from her latest sketch. Carmen, who'd been observing Rosa's movements with growing understanding, smiled. "I think she's about to show us what real hospitality looks like." Rosa had gathered the leftover turkey, stuffing and various sides onto the serving counter. From her own bag, she produced items Dorothy hadn't noticed before: small containers of spices, a worn wooden cutting board, and what appeared to be masa harina. "She's making tamales," Carmen said with wonder. "She's turning your Thanksgiving leftovers into tamales." Eleanor joined Rosa at the counter, drawn by curiosity and the universal language of cooking. Despite their language barrier, the two women began working together with an efficiency that spoke to decades of experience feeding others. Eleanor's precise movements, learned from years of following recipes exactly, complemented Rosa's intuitive approach to seasoning and preparation. "Can I help?" Sage asked, abandoning her sketchbook for the first time all evening. Rosa nodded enthusiastically, guiding Sage's hands as she showed her how to spread masa on corn husks. The teenager's artistic precision translated perfectly to the delicate work of tamale assembly. Tommy had been watching the activity with growing excitement. "This is like something out of a movie," he said, his manic energy channeled into appreciation rather than anxiety. "The international fusion of comfort food. Rosa, you're a genius." As more people gathered around the improvised cooking station, Dorothy realized she was witnessing something extraordinary. Rosa, who'd been the quietest member of their gathering, who spoke the least English and had seemed almost invisible throughout dinner, was revealing herself to be a master chef and natural teacher. "Mira," Rosa said to Dorothy, demonstrating how to fold the corn husks. Her hands moved with the confidence of someone who'd done this thousands of times, but her expression was patient, encouraging. "You ran a restaurant," Dorothy said, not a question but a statement of growing understanding. Rosa's face lit up with pride and sadness in equal measure. "See? In San Salvador. 23 years. Very popular. People come from other cities for my tamales." Carmen translated for the room. She had a restaurant in El Salvador for 23 years. People traveled just to eat her tamales. The revelation shifted something in the room's dynamic. Suddenly, Rosa wasn't just the quiet woman who helped with cooking. She was a master craftsperson sharing her expertise, transforming simple leftovers into something approaching art. "What happened to the restaurant?" Eleanor asked gently. Rosa's expression darkened. Through a combination of Spanish, English, and gesture, she conveyed the story: gang violence, extortion demands, threats against her family. The choice between paying money they didn't have or facing consequences they couldn't survive. "We leave everything," she said simply. "Come here with nothing. But I bring this." She gestured to her hands, to the knowledge that couldn't be taken. Way. As the tamales steamed in an improvised setup Carmen had created using the community center's kitchen equipment, other revelations began to emerge naturally from the evening's deepened intimacy. Sage, emboldened by Rosa's example, opened her sketchbook more fully. "I want to show you something," she said, turning to a section Dorothy hadn't seen before. The pages revealed not just the street scenes and portraits Dorothy had admired earlier, but architectural drawings of incredible sophistication. "I want to design buildings," Sage said. Her defensive armor completely dropped now. Community centers, affordable housing, places where people can gather safely. I've been studying architecture, online, teaching myself through library computers and YouTube videos. She showed them detailed drawings of a proposed homeless services complex. Not the institutional buildings Dorothy knew from her career, but spaces designed with dignity and beauty, places that honored the humanity of their residents. "These are extraordinary," Eleanor said, her teacher's eye recognizing talent when she saw it. "You have a gift, Sage. These drawings show an understanding of space and function that most trained architects would envy." Marcus Johnson looked up from where he'd been gently transferring his sleeping daughters to a makeshift bed Carmen had arranged using yoga mats and blankets. "You design buildings?" "I want to, but you need a college degree, and I don't even have a high school diploma." "GED first," Eleanor said with the authority of an educator. "I can help you with that. Then community college for basic requirements. Portland State has an excellent architecture program. I can't afford one step at a time," Frank interrupted. "First things first. Get the GED, then worry about the next step." The conversation was interrupted by Tommy, who'd been uncharacteristically quiet while the tamales cooked. "Can I tell you all something?" he asked, his usual manic energy replaced by something more vulnerable. "Of course," Dorothy said. "I haven't taken my medication in 3 weeks. Ran out. Couldn't afford to refill it. Was too proud to ask for help." He looked around the room at faces that had become familiar, safe. "I was planning to. Well, I was planning not to be here much longer, but tonight, being part of this, feeling useful and valued, it reminded me that maybe there are still reasons to stick around." The admission hung in the air, heavy with implication. Dorothy recognized the careful phrasing, the way people spoke about suicidal ideation when they were beginning to move back from the edge. Frank was the first to respond. "There's a clinic on Sandy Boulevard that works on sliding scale fees. I can take you there tomorrow if you want." "We can all go," Eleanor added. "Sometimes these things are easier when you don't have to face them alone." Carmen, who'd been listening while monitoring the tamales, pulled out her phone. "I'm texting you the contact information for our mental health coordinator. She's good people, and she understands the system." Tommy's eyes filled with tears. He didn't try to hide. "I haven't had people offer to help me in. I can't remember how long." "That's what family does," Dorothy said, the word carrying new weight after her conversation with David. "Real family shows up." As if summoned. By the mention of showing up, Pastor Williams approached the group hesitantly. Throughout the evening, he'd seemed increasingly uncomfortable with the authentic intimacy developing around him, as if the real connections forming didn't match his expectations of ministry to the homeless. "I wanted to say," he began awkwardly, "that this has been very educational for me." Frank's expression sharpened slightly. "Educational how?" Pastor Williams looked around the room, seeming to realize that his words were being weighed carefully. "I think I came here expecting to minister to people, to offer spiritual guidance and comfort. But instead, I feel like I'm the one who's been ministered to." He paused, clearly struggling with something. "My congregation does a lot of charity work. We organize food drives, donate to shelters, volunteer at soup kitchens. But we never just sit and eat together. We never learn people's names or hear their stories. We help from a distance, and then we go home feeling good about ourselves." Dorothy recognized the moment of genuine revelation, the discomfort. That came with realizing you'd been approaching something wrong for a long time. "Tonight, I've met a master chef, a gifted architect, a talented musician, a brilliant teacher, a medic who's saved lives, and a social worker who's devoted her life to helping others. And I almost missed all of that because I came here thinking I knew who you were based on your circumstances." He looked directly at Dorothy. "Thank you for inviting me to dinner with your friends. Real friends, not a charity case." The tamales finished steaming just as Pastor Williams finished speaking. Rosa began carefully unwrapping them, the corn husks revealing perfectly formed tamales that filled the room with an aroma that spoke of home, comfort, and the kind of love that transforms ordinary ingredients into something extraordinary. First, taste goes to Dorothy, Rosa announced in her careful English. She brings us together. She makes family. Dorothy accepted the tamale with reverence, understanding that she was being offered more than food. She was being offered belonging, acceptance, and the recognition that her impulse to share had created something none of them could have achieved alone. As she took her first bite, tasting the way Rosa had transformed her simple Thanksgiving leftovers into something entirely new and wonderful, Dorothy realized that she'd learned something profound about giving and receiving, about the difference between charity and community, about what it really meant to be chosen by family. The tamales had been shared and savored, their warmth filling bellies already satisfied, but somehow finding room for Rosa's masterpiece. As the evening deepened toward night, the community center took on the quality of a living room where family gathers after a meal, comfortable, intimate, reluctant to end. Carmen Rodriguez stood at the front of the room, a clipboard in hand, and the focused energy of someone transitioning from celebration to action. "Before we start thinking about heading out," she announced, "I want to talk about what comes next." Dorothy looked around at faces that had become dear to her over the course of a single evening. The Johnson twins were still sleeping peacefully on their makeshift bed, while Marcus and Destiny spoke quietly with Frank about immediate needs. Sage had returned to her sketchbook, but was now drawing architectural plans rather than portraits. Eleanor was organizing leftover food with the efficiency of someone who understood the value of not wasting resources. "Tonight was beautiful," Carmen continued, "but beauty without action is just sentiment. If we're going to call ourselves family, we need to figure out how to take care of each other beyond tonight." She pulled out her phone and opened what appeared to be a comprehensive contact list. "I've been doing community organizing for 8 years. I know where the resources are, but resources don't help if people don't know how to access them or if they're too complicated to navigate alone." Frank nodded approvingly. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking we create an actual support network. Not case management, not charity, but mutual aid. People helping people because that's what communities do." Eleanor looked up from her food organizing. "What would that look like practically?" Carmen consulted her clipboard. "Eleanor, you mentioned you could help with GED preparation. Sage needs that, but so do probably a dozen other people in our extended network. What if we set up tutoring sessions here at the center, say Tuesday, and Thursday evenings?" "I'd be delighted," Eleanor said, her educator's instincts clearly energized by the prospect of returning to teaching. "I have all my materials in storage. Well, most of them." "Tommy," Carmen continued, "you mentioned music therapy helped you process trauma. Would you be interested in leading some kind of music group? Nothing formal, just people getting together to play, sing, share songs?" Tommy's eyes lit up with the first genuinely stable energy Dorothy had seen from him all evening. "I used to run songwriting workshops in Nashville. Before everything fell apart, I'd love to do that again." "Marcus, you mentioned construction skills. We've got people living in tents who could use help winterizing their shelters. Would you be willing to coordinate some kind of basic home improvement assistance?" Marcus looked at Destiny, who nodded encouragingly. "My back's still healing, but I can teach, supervise, help people learn to do things safely." Dorothy watched this transformation with wonder. Carmen wasn't just organizing services. She was creating purpose, helping people understand that their skills and experience had value beyond their current circumstances. "What about you, Dorothy?" Carmen asked. 40 years of social work. Experience. You know the system better than almost anyone. Would you consider helping people navigate bureaucracy, housing applications, disability claims, benefits enrollment? Dorothy felt something click into place, like a puzzle piece finding its proper position. I'd love that. I've been feeling useless since retirement, like all that knowledge didn't matter anymore. Are you kidding? Frank said. You know where the bodies are buried in every agency in Portland. That's invaluable. Rosa had been listening intently, following the conversation through context and the few English phrases she recognized. She approached Carmen and spoke quietly in Spanish. Carmen's face lit up. Rosa wants to know if we could do cooking classes. Teach people how to prepare nutritious meals on limited budgets, how to make a little food stretch further. And tamale making. Workshops, Sage added with a grin. Those were incredible. Rosa blushed with pride, nodding enthusiastically. Pastor Williams, who'd been unusually quiet since his earlier revelation, cleared his throat. My church has a commercial kitchen that sits empty most of the week. Rosa could use it for cooking classes, and we could use it for meal preparation if people wanted to cook together regularly. Frank studied him carefully. What's the catch? No catch. No required attendance at services, no preaching during cooking time. Just use of the space because it's the right thing to do. Dorothy could see Frank calculating, assessing, trying to determine if this was genuine offering or disguised evangelism. And your congregation would be okay with that? Pastor Williams looked thoughtful. Some of them might need to learn the same lessons I learned tonight. Maybe it's time they did. Carmen was taking notes rapidly. Okay, so we've got tutoring, music therapy, practical skills sharing, system navigation, cooking classes, and potentially a regular community meal. What about meeting times? Eleanor consulted a small calendar she'd pulled from her purse. I could do tutoring Tuesday and Thursday evenings, as mentioned. Perhaps 6 to 8? Music group could be Wednesday evenings, Tommy suggested. After dinner, but before people need to settle in for the night. Saturday morning for construction and weatherization work, Marcus added. People can work at their own pace, learn as they go. Dorothy felt a familiar energy building, the satisfaction of coordinating services, of matching needs with resources, of creating systems that actually worked for the people they were meant to serve. What about a regular dinner, not just holidays, but maybe once a week? Give people a reason to come together consistently? Sunday evenings, Carmen said immediately. Community dinner every Sunday. Rosa can coordinate cooking. People can contribute what they can. Everyone eats regardless of contribution. Frank was nodding slowly, his military mind clearly organizing logistics. We'll need to establish some basic ground rules. Respect for the space, cleaning up after ourselves, no violence or threats of violence. And no discrimination, Sage added firmly. No judging people for their circumstances, their appearance, their choices. No proselytizing, Eleanor added, glancing at Pastor Williams. This is community building, not religious conversion. Pastor Williams nodded readily. Agreed completely. Dorothy looked around the room, seeing something she'd never quite witnessed before. The organic formation of genuine community infrastructure. Not services imposed from outside, but mutual aid growing from authentic relationships. What about communication? She asked. How do we keep people informed about activities, changes, emergency needs? Carmen held up her phone. Group text for people who have phones. Physical bulletin board here at the center for announcements. And word of mouth through Frank's network. Frank was already thinking strategically. We'll need backup plans. For everything. Weather, space availability, people's changing circumstances. And we'll need to be prepared for the fact that not everyone will participate consistently. That's okay, Dorothy said. People will engage as they're able, when they're ready. The important thing is that the community exists, that people know they have somewhere to belong. Sage looked up from her architectural drawings. What if this actually works? What if we create something real here? Tommy strummed a quiet chord on his guitar. Then we'll have done something beautiful, something that matters. Eleanor was organizing contact information with the methodical approach she'd probably used for lesson planning. We'll need to track what works and what doesn't, adjust as we learn. Dorothy felt tears prick her eyes as she looked around at these people who'd become family in a single evening, who were now planning a future together, built on mutual support and genuine care. "When do we start?" she asked. Carmen checked her calendar. "How about this Thursday? GED tutoring with Eleanor. See who shows up, how it goes. And Sunday for our first official community dinner," Rosa added in her careful English. Frank stood, his natural leadership asserting itself. "Then we start Thursday, and we keep showing up for each other until we don't need to anymore. Or until we realize we want to keep showing up, because that's what family does," Dorothy corrected gently. As people began gathering their belongings, exchanging phone numbers, making specific plans to see each other again, Dorothy realized that her Thanksgiving morning abandonment had led to something she'd never expected. Not just a single evening of connection, but the foundation of ongoing community, the beginning of chosen family that would extend far beyond the holiday that had brought them together. The Morrison Community Center felt different as the evening wound toward its close, not just because of the rearranged furniture or the lingering aroma of Rosa's tamales, but because it had been transformed from an institutional space into something approaching home. Dorothy moved through the room, helping with cleanup, but finding herself reluctant to disturb the evidence of what had happened here. Sage's sketches were scattered across one table, not just her evening's work documenting the gathering, but the architectural drawings she'd shared, her visions of spaces designed for human dignity. Eleanor had left behind a small stack of books, materials for the tutoring sessions that would begin Thursday. Tommy's guitar case sat open, sheet music, spilling out where he'd been writing down chord progressions for songs people had hummed throughout the evening. "Hard to believe this was all improvised," Carmen said, approaching Dorothy with a cardboard box full of leftover food containers. "Feels like something we've been doing for years." Dorothy helped her distribute the remaining food among people who could use it for tomorrow's meals. The practical care of ensuring no one left empty-handed had become as natural as clearing plates after a family dinner. "That's because it wasn't really improvised," Dorothy realized aloud. "We were all ready for this. We just needed the excuse to find each other." Frank was coordinating rides for people who needed transportation back to the camp or to other overnight locations. The Johnson family would be staying at a motel room Carmen had arranged through her emergency assistance fund, just for tonight. But it would give Marcus and Destiny time to apply for several housing programs Dorothy had told them about. "You sure about Thursday?" Frank asked Eleanor, who was carefully packing her thermos and the few personal items she'd brought. "Absolutely certain. 6 o'clock sharp. I'll have basic GED prep materials, but also some poetry and literature. Education should nourish the soul, not just check boxes." Sage approached them, her sketchbook tucked under her arm. "Eleanor, I've been thinking about what you said about community college. How would someone like me even begin to figure that out?" Eleanor's face lit up with the particular joy of a teacher who'd found a genuinely motivated student. "We'll research it. Together. Financial aid, placement tests, course requirements. And Dorothy can help navigate the administrative maze. I used to help families understand college applications all the time," Dorothy confirmed. "It's less complicated than it seems, just intimidating if you're doing it alone." Rosa appeared at Dorothy's elbow with a carefully wrapped package. "Para ti," she said, pressing it into Dorothy's hands. "Thank you for today." Dorothy unwrapped the package to find a dozen perfectly formed tamales, along with a small container of Rosa's homemade salsa. "Rosa, these are too precious to give away." "No," Rosa said firmly, her English clear despite its careful cadence. "You give us more than food today. You give us familia, family. This is for your breakfast tomorrow, so you remember." Tommy, had been packing up his guitar, but he paused to address the room. "Before everyone leaves, I want to say something." His manic energy had settled into something steadier, more grounded. "I came here tonight planning for this to be my last Thanksgiving. I want you all to know that's changed, not because everything is suddenly perfect, but because now I have reasons to see Thursday and Sunday and whatever comes after that." The simple statement hung in the air, acknowledging both the darkness he'd been carrying and the light that had begun to pierce it. Frank gripped Tommy's shoulder briefly, the kind of wordless support that passed between people who understood. Survival. Pastor Williams approached Dorothy as she finished packing the last of her serving dishes. "Dorothy, I owe you an apology. You don't owe me anything. I came here tonight thinking I was going to minister to people. Instead, I've been ministered to in ways I'm still trying to understand." He paused, looking around the room. "My congregation talks a lot about Christian fellowship, but we've never actually practiced it. We help from a distance, donate from comfort, pray for people we've never actually met." Dorothy recognized the discomfort of someone whose worldview was shifting. "What will you tell them?" "The truth. That I learned more about the gospel tonight eating tamales with people my church would probably cross the street to avoid than I have in 20 years of seminary-trained sermons." Marcus and Destiny were gathering their sleeping daughters, Hope and Faith's faces peaceful in the way only children can achieve after a day of safety and abundance. "Dorothy," Destiny said, quietly, "the girls want to know if you'll be at the Sunday dinner. I wouldn't miss it." Hope stirred in her father's arms. "Miss Dorothy, will you make turkey again?" "We'll see, sweetheart. What would you like me to make?" "Surprise me," Hope said with the wisdom of someone who'd learned that surprises could be wonderful as well as terrible. As people prepared for final departures, Dorothy found herself exchanging contact information with nearly everyone. Not out of social obligation, but from genuine desire to maintain the connections that had formed. Sage insisted on giving her a small sketch of the evening's tamale-making session. Eleanor pressed a bookmark into her hand with a poem by Maya Angelou about human connection. Frank gave her the number for a 24-hour crisis line, just in case anyone you meet needs it. Carmen was the last to leave, helping Dorothy carry her serving dishes to the car. The rain had returned, but lightly, more mist than precipitation, and Portland's evening air felt clean and full of possibility. "You realize what you've started, don't you?" Carmen asked as they loaded the last container. "I just cooked too much food." "You created family for people who'd given up on the possibility of belonging anywhere. That's not small, Dorothy. That's not accidental." Dorothy looked back at the community center, its windows glowing warmly in the evening darkness. Through the glass, she could see the tables they'd arranged, still configured for community rather than efficiency. Tomorrow, those tables would host other activities, senior programs, children's after-school care, neighborhood meetings. But Thursday evening, they would become classroom space for Eleanor's tutoring. Sunday evening, they would become dining room for their chosen family's weekly gathering. "Will it work?" Dorothy asked. "Can something that started this spontaneously actually become sustainable?" Carmen smiled. "The best community programs I've ever seen started exactly like this. Not with grants or mission statements or strategic plans, but with people who cared about each other deciding to keep showing up." As Dorothy drove home through Portland's quiet streets, she found herself taking a different route than she had that morning. Instead of the direct path through familiar neighborhoods, she drove past the camp where she'd first encountered Frank, past the bridge where people were settling in for another night outdoors, past the 24-hour laundromat where Marcus had mentioned taking his family to wash clothes. The city looked different now. Not because anything had physically changed, but because she now carried stories that connected her to places she'd previously driven past without seeing. She knew that Eleanor was probably reading in her car by the light of a small LED lamp. She knew that Rosa was likely preparing for her night shift cleaning offices, carrying the dignity of a master chef into work that paid barely enough to survive. She knew that Tommy was somewhere with his guitar, writing songs about hope instead of despair. Her apartment, when she finally reached it, felt both familiar and transformed. The dining room table still sat set for 12, but instead of mocking her with its emptiness, it seemed to be waiting patiently for its next purpose. Dorothy began clearing the place's settings, but found herself moving slowly, not from reluctance, but from a kind of reverence for the morning's expectations that had led to the evening's revelations. She packed away the good china carefully, but left the table itself configured for gathering. Thursday evening, she realized, she could host the overflow from Eleanor's tutoring sessions if the community center became too crowded. Sunday afternoon, she could use this space to prepare food for their weekly dinners. The apartment that had felt like a monument to abandonment this morning now felt like headquarters for belonging. Dorothy made herself a cup of tea using Eleanor's Earl Grey method and sat in her living room with Rosa's tamales and a profound sense of satisfaction. Her phone buzzed with text messages, Sage sharing a photo of her evening's sketches, Carmen confirming Thursday's logistics, Frank checking that she'd made it home safely. She opened her laptop and began researching GED requirements, housing assistance programs, sliding scale mental health services, and community college scholarship opportunities. The familiar rhythm of connecting people with resources felt natural, again, but different now. Not professional obligation, but family care. As Portland settled into night around her, Dorothy began planning next week's activities. Not for the absent family who had abandoned her that morning, but for the chosen family who had embraced her that evening. She would visit Sage's informal gallery under the Morrison Bridge. She would accompany Tommy to the mental health clinic Frank had recommended. She would help Eleanor organize her tutoring materials and Carmen coordinate the Sunday dinner logistics. Her calendar, which had been empty except for medical appointments and grocery runs, began filling with purpose. Thursday, GED tutoring. Saturday, help Marcus winterize shelters. Sunday, community dinner. Monday, accompany Eleanor to housing. Assistance appointments. Tuesday, more tutoring. Wednesday, Tommy's music group. Dorothy smiled as she realized that her retirement had finally begun in earnest. Not the passive waiting for family visits and holiday inclusion she'd been doing for the past 2 years, but the active construction of community and meaning. She'd spent 40 years helping other people's families navigate crisis and connection. Now she would spend whatever years remained building and nurturing a family of her own choosing. She turned off the lights and headed toward bed, but paused at her dining room table. Tomorrow, she would shop for Thursday's tutoring session snacks. This weekend, she would research funding for Sage's art supplies and Tommy's musical equipment. Next week, she would begin the long process of helping people she'd known for only hours navigate systems she'd spent decades understanding. Dorothy Martinez had awakened that morning as someone whose family had found her dispensable. She was going to sleep as someone whose chosen family found her indispensable. The transformation felt like the best Thanksgiving miracle of all. Outside, Portland's rain continued its gentle rhythm, but inside Dorothy's apartment, soon to become community center auxiliary space, tutoring headquarters, and chosen family gathering place, everything was warm, purposeful, and ready for whatever tomorrow would bring. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.